95% of eating disorders start with some kind of diet, and it can very quickly spiral out of control.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to 80% Mental, the best podcast in arguably the whole world. I'm here as usual with Dr. Leah Washington. Leah, how's things? How's your week?
Things are great, except that I'm feeling I'm dying of a cold right now. So I apologize to all of our listeners for sounding like gross.
Yeah, well, we agreed before we came on that Leah's just going to mute her mic if she has a coughing fit or a sneezing fit. So you guys don't have to hear that because it is gross. So this series of the podcast, we're diving into all things related to exercise and health and well-being, how that relates to athlete populations, but perhaps how us normal folk can benefit from learning about some of that stuff too. And one thing that I've wanted to talk about for a little while is eating disorders. And I guess to kind of start this episode, if you're listening to this and we are talking about eating disorders, that can potentially be a little bit triggering. So we will put some links in the episode description if anybody experiences any kind of distress or feels affected by some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So I just wanted to kind of say that up front. But I'm really delighted to have our guest today, who is Dr. Marina Harris. I'm so glad that she's been able to find the time to come on the podcast. Marina, welcome to 80% Mental.
Hi, I'm so grateful to be here. Thanks for having me on.
No, you're more than welcome. How's your day been so far?
It's been great. Had a slow morning, which is very welcome, and have my coffee, so ready to go.
Good to go. Because, of course, it's early morning where you are as well. I've managed to get through half the day so far. So.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I know. It's even more of an accomplishment that we were able to find time to meet when you're across the world. So.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad to have you. And just for people who don't know, I will give you the official 80% Mental introduction. Dr. Marina Harris is a licensed psychologist, performance consultant, and speaker. And as a former Division I gymnast, she's got a really good understanding of some of the unique stresses that affect athletes and performers. She's got her own psychology practice, Bloom Psychology Group, which offers individual therapy and sports psychology services for perfectionistic high achievers who want to feel a little bit more calm. So we maybe talk a little bit about that later on. But let's kind of get into the episode. We're going to talk about eating disorders, disordered eating. And I guess it would be really good to start by just pinning down some of those definitions. So that I can understand it more than anything. Like, what is the difference, Marina, between an eating disorder and what we might refer to as disordered eating?
Yeah, well, in my philosophy, there isn't too much of a difference between those two things. I think that's a really big misnomer for people. So when we think about eating disorders, the big thing that we think about is food restriction. Or some type of food disturbance, whether it's restriction of energy intake or the opposite, where people feel like they eat too much or lose control over eating. And there's oftentimes some kind of weight or shape disturbance, meaning that there is a disconnect between what somebody's appearance or body actually looks like and how they view their bodies. And then there's a lot of health complications that are at times associated with eating disorders. And so certain eating disorders have criteria or stipulations that include those health complications and others do not. So that could be some of the differences that people expect with disordered eating versus eating disorders. But one thing that I really like to educate people about is that 95% of eating disorders start with some kind of diet. And I see this a lot anecdotally in my practice as well. You know, people just have this idea that they just want to get healthier. They just want to improve their performance, and they just start slow. They might start by making healthy substitutes. They substitute like higher fat items for lower fat items or low calorie items, or they might try to reduce their carbohydrates, or they might even try some of these labeled diets like Atkins or keto, and it can very quickly spiral out of control. And so what I want people to be really careful about is that just sort of this subthreshold disordered eating can also be really dangerous. It doesn't have to be this classic anorexia or bulimia that people think about, because it can very easily spiral into that. But also to note that some of these subthreshold eating disorders, like we call them, like other specified feeding and eating disorders, they can actually have the same or similar mortality rates and health complications to classic anorexia and bulimia. And so we think about sometimes disordered eating as just as dangerous and sinister as full-blown eating disorder, because it can very easily turn into that. And sometimes people don't realize that they have health complications until they have a physician that knows what to look for.
And I think we also see like there's the more recent form of, I guess it's called orthorexia, of like overly checking ingredients and being like, you know, is it all natural, and you know, kind of being like consumed by the thoughts of like, is this good for me? Is this going to be healthy? And I've definitely seen this in some of my clients to varying degrees of like, you know, there's almost like this altruistic component of like, oh, I'm going to be vegan for the environment. And you're like, are you though? Like, is that your real motivation for like cutting out dairy and cutting out like eggs and all of these things? And it's like, it's always interesting to me to see how not just like the eating patterns, but like the distorted belief systems of how they like wrap around and justify some of these of like, it's not just about, you know, performance, right? It's also about like this idea of being kinder to the world, which is all good things, right? And thinking very broadly about, you know, the food that we consume is a good thing. But then how does it, there's always like that tipping point of like, at what point does it become like, okay, now maybe we're getting a little bit too consumed with this idea, or like a little too fixated on like percentages and sourcing our ingredients and all of those things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Leah, that is a great point. And I think what you're looking for is that term like morality. Like we moralize food choices, we moralize body shapes, and we moralize weight, and we apply labels as things are good or bad, better or worse. And we do that a lot, especially with things like all natural or non-processed foods, but then also you potentially see people adopting these restrictive diets like veganism. And, you know, there are definitely people who choose to adopt a vegan diet for the environment. And actually, I've heard that being vegan is like one of the best things you can do for the environment. But it's so easy to disguise eating disorders in the morality that society applies to food. Like it's so easy for eating disorders to fly under the radar for that reason.
And I guess we're seeing kind of a proliferation of those sorts of, I don't want to say fad diets, but those types of things that you're talking about, like going vegan, keto, like fasting, like we're seeing a proliferation of that sort of stuff via, you know, the internet, which I guess is kind of in social media, which is kind of just exacerbating the problem. I guess full sort of disclosure, and I talked about this a little bit in the first episode of this series with Clara Swedland. Like I've always had a crappy relationship with both food and with exercise, and I don't mind saying that, but I've never felt like it's been like a quote unquote problem. But when should somebody like me, who I'm very aware of my own relationships with food, when should somebody like me like be concerned that it is spilling over into something that, okay, maybe I should kind of look out for this?
Yeah. One exercise that I really like to do with people is to ask about how much brain space is taken up by food, weight, shape, eating, or exercise. Mm-hmm. And if it's more than you want it to, if it conflicts with your values, if like in your true values, your true wisest self, you are spending a lot more time on appearance than you truly want to. I think that can help highlight for people like, yeah, I tell other people I don't care about appearance and it doesn't matter what you look like. And yet I'm criticizing myself if I don't go to the gym or I'm not taking rest days. And like that doesn't actually feel good to me. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one thing to watch out for. The things that I also tell people about with exercise is if you're exercising when you're sick or injured, it's a big red flag. Like you need to take rest days.
I feel seen.
I feel seen. Good. A gentle call in, hopefully.
Yeah. I wasn't anticipating this would turn into a therapy session, but you know.
It's not. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Yeah, so if people are exercising when they're sick or injured, that's a red flag. Or mm-hmm. if they feel like it's less of a choice than they want it to feel, like if they're feeling internal pressure, like I just have to exercise today. I feel like I have to do it. I feel like I just can't let myself not, or I just can't, not follow this plan I've set for myself. That's when it starts to get out of the realm of being effective and healthy and adaptive.
And I think that's a really interesting point because I have definitely seen that from a sports medicine perspective where this was many years ago, and this was not my sport, not my athlete. There was an athlete who was quote unquote caught she was doing an elliptical workout in a walking boot, and she got labeled as non-compliant to her rehab. And they kind of missed for a long time that was like, actually, this isn't about fitness. This is a bigger, broader issue. And eventually it came to a head and kind of like got her resources and got it taken care of. But like there for a long time, there was like a proliferation of, this athlete, they're going to lie to you. They're going to like get around anything that you try and tell them to do. Like, don't trust anything they say. And then there was like this weird like narrative of like, this person is a non-compliant, non-adherent athlete where it's like, no, actually, you fucking missed this whole big, huge red flag. This is actually on you, not on the athlete. And I think, and this was like sort of pretty early on in my career. And I was like, that was like a real like eye opener for me. Like, what are we talking about here? Like, what are we saying about our athletes and how are we determining our perceptions of these athletes and what am I actually missing?
Right. Yes. And there's so much stigma with eating disorders. You hit the nail on the head. And the disappointing part for me is that the institution that you were at is so quick to label the individual athlete, but has no acknowledgement of the systemic factors and things that they were likely doing and setting up in the environment that potentially made the athlete feel like they had to do that.
Like if like there was no way, like if she knew that like that was the perception of hers, like, oh, that's not a safe space for somebody to come and be like, oh, actually I'm having this really big problem and I'm struggling.
Right.
It was a complete breakdown in like all sorts of care. Like, and I'm like super grateful that she eventually got the help that she needed. But like for a long time, it was really contentious and it had no business being like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Eating disorders are heavily stigmatized. And I also think that athletic environments are very like health focused and morality focused. Mm-hmm. And they also ascribe to these problematic beliefs that reinforce eating disorders, like, mental toughness at all costs, must always exercise when you're sick or injured, have to show up to practice. And of course, these athletes feel pressure to do that, and they don't know how to rest and take care of themselves.
And thinking about the culture in sport, and elite sport in particular, we're asking athletes to be ultra strict, right? And we're asking them to monitor body fat, commenting on their aesthetics, we're expecting them to be able to handle all of that stuff, right? But to do it in a healthy way, like we're asking too much, right?
Yep. I'm sure you could guess how I feel about that.
So I guess building on that, if we're thinking about like eating disorders within that culture and within that context of elite sport, like who else should be there? Because it's too much to ask the athlete to do all of that stuff, but also do it in a really healthy way. So who else needs to be there? Who else has responsibility, I guess, a duty of care towards the athletes?
Well, I think you need a dietitian who is well versed on these and can catch these signs and symptoms. You need strength trainers, athletic trainers who are acknowledging the role of diet culture and problematic sort of athlete toughness culture influences, and working to help their athletes perform in ways that are not hyper-focused on appearance and not obsessive and driven and compulsive.
And then I guess, coming back to some of that cultural stuff, thinking outside of sport as well, there's all sorts of different cultural influences. I lived through the era of the stick thin supermodel, the Men's Health covers, now we've got the superstar actors.
Skinny feels, right?
Right. We've got the superstar actors posting their workout regimes, right? And they're definitely not all on drugs. The gym culture of today, and the Instagram fitness models, all of that stuff, right? Like all of that stuff has an influence on things like body dysmorphia, right? And that can have an impact on athletes as well as kind of people outside of sport. This is a huge question, but like, how do we start to dismantle some of those like really damaging influences? Like, where do we even begin with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are a lot of influencers who are already doing it, right? The Health at Every Size movement is doing it. Body neutrality movements are doing it. And I would say listen to the people and the voices who are already doing this. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, right? I also think that we need to have better representation, right? We need those people who are talking about body weight and shape and exercise, who are from historically disadvantaged backgrounds, who are ethnic and racial minorities, who have visible and invisible disabilities. And we need to listen to those voices rather than this sort of like white-centric, Instagram fitness culture that is really running rampant right now.
I also think it's really interesting just to like point out to people, I think a lot about, comparing like magazine covers. And from a men's perspective, like whenever I see like Jason Momoa or Hugh Jackman on the cover of like Men's Health, he's always like super shredded. And I'm like, oh my God, you look so hungry. And like, but like just like ripped. And then like you see him on the cover of like Women's Wear Daily or whatever. And he's like soft lighting, cashmere sweater, dad bod. Who that body image is being marketed to is, and you can just like hold the magazines like side by side and be like, this is the same person to two very different audiences. Who is the audience and what message are they being sent? And when it's so obvious that these two very different images are for two very different populations.
Yeah. Well, it highlights the algorithm, right, of marketing. I know we were sort of talking about magazines, but with social media, think about who's getting that shredded picture of Hugh Jackman. It's the people who already might be exercising when they're sick or injured, or who are unhappy with their body and those types of things. And I would also think about, even looking at those two images side by side, like they both make you feel like crap, right? It's like, oh, this is a body I could never attain. And then it's like, oh, this sweater is $300, could never get that, right? Or, all of these things, they just make us feel bad. And it's really sad. It's just really sad to me.
I also think like there's a lot of what I often see is like, fashion designers like Christian Siriano who like goes over and above like his efforts to make designer gowns and haute couture gowns for all sizes of women. And you see his dresses on like these incredible actresses at any size, but it's like he gets lots of praise for it and lots of like good press for it. There's almost like this undercurrent of like, well, he did it, so like we can check that box off now. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of like, where are the other designers doing this? Like, why is this the only designer that these women of, who aren't these like stick thin, rail thin, sample size bodies? And so it's almost like it reinforces this idea of singularity almost, of like, well, no, we took care of that. It's fine now.
It's the classic token, like minority problem, right? It's like, oh, we hired this ethnic minority so we can check the box. We, are making dresses for plus size folks so we can check this box. And that's not, I think you're shining a light that's not acceptable. We all need to do better in representation in what real bodies look like. You mentioned sample sizes. The average woman in America is size 16, I think. And what's a sample size? Probably 0 to 4. Not at all anywhere close to what the average woman looks like. And so your average woman is scrolling on social media and seeing pictures of not average women and then feeling less than, even though their bodies are likely perfectly average and potentially metabolically healthy. That's another thing I wanted to highlight, is the metrics that we have for health, like BMI, just misclassify metabolic health at a high rate, and it's problematic.
Why do we still use BMI? Why do we still use BMI? Because we know that it's like a nonsense. Insurance.
Doctors don't get paid unless they take weights and they check BMI. And I don't know what motivation insurance companies have to keep using it. I'm sure it ties to profits, but we are, at least in the United States, I can't speak for other countries, but at least in the United States, we're very limited by insurance.
Yeah. And I guess just for anybody who's listening who doesn't quite know what we're talking about here with BMI, can you explain what BMI is and why it's a pretty poor metric for measuring health in any kind of way whatsoever?
Yes. BMI is body mass index. And there are a lot more scholars who will say this probably more eloquently than I. But in short, BMI has been found to be not only inaccurate in metabolically classifying health, but it's also racist and classist. And
as are most things, right?
That's true. Nobody is immune. No things are immune. And it was also created by a mathematician. Like, it wasn't even created by a physician. Yeah. And so I don't know why we keep using it. Although I say that, and I don't use BMI, but I use a metric called ideal body weight percentage, based on some MetLife charts that talk about like where somebody should be for their age. But I still have to use like BMI or these like underweight sort of metrics to diagnose eating disorders. And so there's not a lot of getting around it. You can try, and I have tried, because we know that like BMI is not a good indicator on the severity of somebody's eating disorder. I've seen people who have really severe eating disorders and have normal BMIs or have high BMIs and need to be hospitalized. And so it's just not a good metric.
Yeah, I think we kind of get away from this idea of like the actual behaviors that people are engaging in and the actual cognitions that people are engaging in. And one of the things that I try to talk to my students about is like, these are the because I work with athletic training students. It's like, yes, these are the diagnostic criteria for specific eating disorders. However, like, don't let that limit you. And when you are working with your athlete, of like, that you may have an athlete who looks quote unquote normal, but like, what actually are their thoughts? How intrusive are they? How, what kind of behaviors are they engaging in? How much time is this taking up in their day? Like, all of these things are going to be way more indicative of, the actual level of distress that this athlete is experiencing, whether or not they fit into this like nice, neat little box. Most people probably don't fit into this like, nice diagnostic like checkbox.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Most eating disorders are actually classified under OSFED, which is other specified feeding and eating disorder, or unspecified feeding and eating disorder. And research has found that there's no difference in the dangerousness of those things. So for your athletic training students, most of them will catch eating disorders that fall under those categories. Most of them, if they're only looking for eating disorders under like anorexia or bulimia, they're going to miss a ton. The other thing that I wanted to mention as related to athletes is eating disorders look very different in athletes compared to non-athletes. And it's important for people working with athletes to know those differences, because like we said before, you can miss a lot of eating disorder cases if you're only checking things out based on how non-athletes look.
So this is the 80% Mental Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Leah Washington and Dr. Marina Harris, and we've been talking about eating disorders in athlete populations, but also outside of sport as well. I hope you've been enjoying the conversation so far. Do follow us on Instagram at 80% Mental, or on Twitter, or X if you prefer to call it that, at EPM Podcast. Although I don't like giving Elon Musk the satisfaction of calling it X, so it'll always be Twitter for me. So Marina, we were just kind of talking there before the break about what were we talking about before the break? Oh, it's a good job this isn't live. So we were just talking a little bit before the break, and I wanted to come back to this idea of what eating disorders, I guess, look like. First of all, what's the sort of prevalence of eating disorders in sport? Do we have any figures on that? Do we know that, or is that information that it's too complex to kind of really to know?
We do have figures on it, and it's a range. And I'm kicking myself because I've written many a paper on this. And I don't remember the statistic, but I will look it up and get back to you, and we can put it in the description for your listeners. Sure, but it is higher than non-athletes, especially in elite sports, and especially in sports that we consider to be aesthetic sports, which are sports that have some kind of like performance, weight or shape demand or judging criteria. So things like gymnastics, diving, figure skating, even cross country. But that doesn't mean that other sports aren't immune or are immune to eating disorders. Like I see a lot of soccer athletes, a lot of lacrosse athletes with eating disorders.
Oh, really?
With anorexia specifically. Yeah.
Okay. And what's the difference? I guess what's the difference in what eating disorders look like between athletes and a non-athlete population? Is there a difference?
There aren't huge differences, but here are the differences that I would tell professionals to watch out for.
Mm-hmm.
The first is that many athletes' eating disorders start out with wanting to be fit for their sport or to be healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So similar to the statistic I said earlier, where 95% of eating disorders start with a diet, many eating disorders in athletes start with, oh, I just wanted to do an extra run once a week. I just wanted to be faster. I just wanted to get better at my sport.
Mm.
And so it's very easy for eating disorders to be disguised under performance demands. Like, I'm just eating better for my performance.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing to watch out for. The other way that eating disorders can look a little bit different than in athletes, I said before that many eating disorders are under that like OSFED, UFED category. And for athletes, it's even more prevalent. If you think about BMI, it's just your height and weight. Athletes have different levels of muscle mass and tend to have lower body fat percentages than non-athletes do. And so if we're just looking at BMI, I've seen many physicians label a client or an athlete as healthy or at an appropriate weight, when in fact they are actually underweight.
Right.
Because athletes have even more problems with BMI, I should say the problems with BMI are even greater in athletes.
Yeah, I think, the struggle with athletes for me also is that like there are so many qualities about being an elite or high performing athlete that help you be that high performing athlete that also lend itself to being very good at having an eating disorder, right? That having like that level of determination and being very goal oriented and you're right, like it very much starts of like just this one thing and like, well, that seemed to help a lot, so maybe I'll do this other thing and maybe I'll add this other thing, and it I think one of the challenges for a lot of people, whether they're in the sports medicine or sports psychology world, is that it does start off with this like slower effect and then kind of like ramps up, and it's like there is no line of like, yep, now we're at an eating disorder, right? Of like, and where do we encourage people to be high performance athletes in these behaviors, and where do we caution them of like, is this a little too much? Is this a little too far? And when you have somebody, especially at these really high levels, right? Like yourself, Marina, I was a gymnast as well, and so like very familiar with like, if I was like maybe a little bit lighter, if I was a little bit smaller, I could like get a little bit higher, and swinging on bars would be a little bit easier, and it's really easy to see how like that can manifest in certain ways. And I think it's a real challenge for the support staff, particularly like coaches. Like, at what point do you encourage versus discourage versus caution versus, I think we don't appreciate so much how difficult it can be.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's such a fine line. And I really respect coaches because they have such a hard job. They have to figure out how to coach each individual athlete the way that athlete can perform their best.
Right.
It is so hard. Like, I really have so much respect for coaches because it's not an easy job. And that's why, like, we should not expect coaches to be eating disorder specialists. Mm-hmm. That's why we have a team. Like, that's why we have physicians. That's why we have dietitians. We have strength coaches. We have athletic trainers. We have nurse practitioners. We have massage therapists, like a whole team of people, so that your coach does not have to be the person that catches all the eating disorders. Now, they have to know the signs, but coaches or sports psychology professionals, any professional listening to this podcast, If you have an athlete that starts talking about wanting to lose weight, being on a diet, eating less, binge eating, feeling like they can't stop exercise, make a referral. You don't have to be the person that knows when it becomes a problem. You have people to do that for you. Always make the referral, and you can tell the athlete, hey, I'm just sending you to this person. They're great. They're going to check you out, and you guys are, going to talk about something. It doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. I just want to make sure that you're eating enough, or I want to make sure we're doing all the things to help you be the best athlete. And then if that professional assesses them and gives them the green light or the green check, they can come back. But the coach does not have to be the one, or the, strength trainer or the athletic trainer. They don't have to be the one doing the eating disorder assessment.
I think also the challenge, to your point, Pete, is like from earlier, it's like, it's not necessarily that I think athletes sometimes have a hard time with their relationship with their weight, but I think they do have a hard time with their relationship with food, right? And how do they think about food? And do they think about it as fuel? Do they think about it as energy? Do they think about it, or do they think about it in like a harmful way? And I think related to that like performance component, and sometimes I do see that it's not about like, am I skinny enough? Am I pretty enough? It's more about like, what is this food doing to me, right? And it's the relationship with the actual food and being afraid of food rather than being afraid of gaining weight.
Yeah. And I think, when you were talking there, I was just thinking about that whole food as fuel message, which is ostensibly supposed to be this kind of positive message. You should be using food to fuel your body, so you're not kind of eating too much. But actually, that can be a pretty damaging message. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Marina.
I do. I totally agree. I think where we get into problems are when things are to one extreme or the other, right? So we took one extreme, which was just like, be thin. and then we were tried to create this like food as fuel to combat that, right? It's like food is energy and you're nourishing your body. But then people took that too far and thought, well, every food I have to put in my body has to have a very specific purpose. And God, of course you're obsessing about food if that's how you're thinking about it. Like food is only serving the purpose of fuel or energy. And like, yes, I do think food is fuel, has a great place in this conversation. And at the same time, food functions in other ways besides just fuel. Food functions for joy and pleasure. Food functions for social connection. Think about our holidays, right?
There's such a cultural component to food, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
and how do we relate to our families and how do we relate to our cultures? And like, if you ever go to like a cultural event, like what's the thing you do? You eat the food, right? And, for I think a lot of athletes, like that is a lot of connection for them.
Yeah. And by saying food is only fuel, we're taking away all of that, like joy and pleasure and connection, and only keeping the punishing aspects of food.
Again,
we don't want to do that.
No, again, this comes right back around to, developing the whole athlete identity. You're not just an athlete, you also have family and connection, and, you're allowed to have fun and enjoy stuff. Eat the cookie, basically.
No, that seems fake. I don't think that's true at all.
Eat the cookie. That should be the title of this podcast. Eat the cookie.
So I you talked there a little bit about coaches and the broader support team identifying some of this stuff, and maybe it's not necessarily their role to do that. We can make referrals. I was going to ask you though, what about in non-sport contexts, right? For perhaps anybody who's listening who isn't an athlete or isn't involved in sport, if you are perhaps suspect that somebody is displaying some of those unhealthy behaviors that we talked about, right? So feeling guilty about not exercising, or constantly monitoring every single thing that goes into their body. if you're starting to see that somebody's displaying those type of behaviors, like how might I approach that?
Yeah, people come to me with this question all the time because many people will know someone in their life who has some kind of eating disorder or problematic relationship with food or weight or shape. The other piece, just really quick, that I want to throw in is that eating disorders are oftentimes genetically transmitted. Eating disorders have a very high genetic component. Okay. And so oftentimes, if a grandmother, mother, parent has challenges with food, they might see that in their teenager. Now, of course, there are influences socially and behaviorally. They might see their parents dieting and hear things they say and things like that. But I do think it's important to note that if you have a family member with an eating disorder, I would just be more aware of yourself and your family members around you, because it's a high likelihood of that developing if you have the right set of circumstances and social factors and personal traits.
Can I ask you a quick question about that? Because I have also seen where, I guess I'm just kind of curious if it even matters, if there's, what the relationship is, because there's also a lot of learned behaviors, right? Especially like mothers to daughters. How do we separate out, and do we even need to, whether this is like, did I learn this from my parents, or is this like a genetic component, and does that matter in terms of like how we're approaching our treatment with our patients and clients?
Yeah, it does matter. I think it's both. There's a strong genetic component, and the way we talk about food matters. Our behaviors around food matter. I actually have a 10 tips for parents worksheet on how to cultivate sort of healthy relationships with foods. And a lot of the stuff in there is like, no good or bad foods. Don't talk negatively about your body or other people's bodies, because people latch onto that. I can't tell you how many sessions I have with someone who will say, yeah, I hear my mom or my dad talk about this, and I immediately made the connection. I'm bad if I eat this, or it's bad to overeat, or I need to stay away from these types of food. And it really sticks with people.
Yeah, I was actually in a session once a while ago with a Division I basketball player, and she was talking about how her mom was like, reminding her that like spring break was coming up and it was going to be like bathing suit season soon. And I was like, what? Why is that? What are we talking? Like, why is that your concern? Like, and so like we had a lot of like a pretty significant conversation. I was like, so, okay, like how did that make you feel? And she was like, I'm trying to play basketball. I was like, yeah, like let's think about our priorities versus like somebody else's priorities. Like, it was just wild, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, well, think about how that affects a kid too. It's like,
totally.
My mom cares more about what my body looks like in a bikini than my basketball career. And how messed up is that?
And it obviously like really bothered her. Like, and she was like, is that like the only thing that matters? And I was like, 100% no. Like, what do you think matters? Like, let's talk about that. But it was just like such an off the wall, like, it just seems like so, and I was like, oh my God, you grew up with this, like your whole life. Like, what messages were you getting? Like, and we had like a much broader conversation about it, but it was like, of all the things that you could bring up, Mom, like this is the thing that we think is the important thing.
Right. Well, people leave their house and think that's normal, and then get into session and I'm like, hey, that is not normal. Like, that's not okay. And here's why. And people are like, oh my gosh, they feel so validated, and they're it's like a revelation to them.
Yeah, she had made this, like, it was a totally offhand comment of like, oh yeah, I was talking to my mom the other day on the phone, and I was like, Well, hold on 1 second. Let's not skip past.
So this is the 80% Mental podcast, and you're listening to myself, Dr. Pete Olusoga, with Dr. Leah Washington and Dr. Marina Harris, and we've been talking about eating disorders, disordered eating in athletes and in non-athlete populations. Marina, it's about this time in the podcast that we like to take a little bit of a break from the topic and to find out a little bit more about our guest as a person, right? A well-rounded individual.
I'm a person.
You're an actual human person.
Wow.
With real life interests and ideas and all that good stuff. So we've got a little game that we play, a series of quick fire questions on different topics. First of all, are you up for playing our little game?
Of course, always.
Cool. I've been doing this quite a while now, and I still haven't thought of a good name for it. I don't think we'll bother at this point. But what we have got, Leah, is some new categories.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to hear the new categories?
Do I?
Okay. So we've got this or that, which is basically just either or, but with a slightly different name. We've got favorites and firsts. We've got hypotheticals. And what else have we got? I can't remember because I didn't write it down. There's another one. I'll think of it later. Anyway.
Pete, you're so relatable.
I know.
Speaking my language.
We're so professional.
Relatable / totally disorganized.
I'm an
Okay.
ADHD girly. I get it.
So
Get it function for the win.
So what I'll get you to do, Marina, is to pick a virtual envelope. So a number between 1 and 4, which will determine the category of quickfire question that you're going to get.
4, please.
4. Okay, let's see. And we've got hypotheticals. So a brand new category, hypotheticals, series of quickfire questions, and we'll get to know you a little bit better. Okay, question 1 then, first question. And given the conversation that we've just been had, I guess this is probably appropriate. If you could remove one thing from the internet, what would that be? I mean, there's so much.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to throw a curveball. I would actually say I would remove
Elon Musk.
problematic. Yeah, I mean, that too. I would remove problematic depictions of death by suicide on it.
Okay, interesting. What's the sort of background to that? If you don't, can I ask?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any personal story or anything like that. I think I just see, and actually, I think the One Direction star who just passed.
Liam Payne,
this brought it up for me. Was just that people were talking about, how journalists have a responsibility to depict suicide in the media appropriately because of social contagion.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when a celebrity dies by suicide, especially if certain details are in the story, you see an uptick in suicide come after that. So there's no personal story, but just more along the lines of like my passion as a mental health professional, wanting to be responsible and keep people alive and here with us. So
I think journalists have got a responsibility for reporting a whole load of different things, but that's certainly one of them. Leah, what about you? What would you remove from the internet?
Nazis.
Oh,
yep, good.
Great answer.
Yep.
Can I amend my answer?
Okay, next question. If you could be any age forever, what age would you pick?
25.
25. Okay.
Solid choice.
Yeah.
I don't know why, except for that I felt less creaky in my body and my joints didn't hurt as bad. And I was having fun. And yeah, that's it.
Cool. Okay. Leah, what would you say?
Yeah, 25 to 30 is probably a good
Yeah.
range.
Okay.
It's like before shit gets real.
Yeah. See, I was thinking about this earlier, and I was thinking, like, for me, it would actually be like more like 35, because it's the first time in my life where I've actually had like any money at all.
Right.
Like, I felt like an actual grown up, and
You feel like a person.
I could like do stuff, and I was kind of like, that was the first time where I sort of, I guess, was like really confident in my own self at being an actual human. So I think like, yeah, 35. I was also like in the best shape of my life at 35 as well. It was like going into my last couple of seasons of playing basketball. So yeah,
Wow.
35, actual adult.
Love that for you.
If you could, thank you. If you could master any skill overnight, what would it be?
Oh, this is such a good one. There's so many choices.
I think for me, learning a language.
Oh yeah. What
If I could
language?
learn a
What language?
I think, well, I could be like really like nitpicky and just say the skill is learning languages. But I think, I don't know, I've always wanted to get better at speaking French. I took French in high school and I always really liked the language.
Mhm.
And I'm also like, I love like etymology, and the relationship between English and French is really strong. And so like just understanding like where words come from, I think that would be cool.
I can speak French well enough to speak in French and then have the French person look at me with pity and reply and just reply in English.
Also, it's the official language of the Olympics, and you know how I feel about the Olympics.
Marina, what about you? What skill, if you could
No.
master a skill overnight, and you've had plenty of time to think about it now, so no
Yes,
excuses.
of course. 2 minutes is plenty of time to think about my hypothetical life. I'm going to think out of the box and say that I would want to master the skill of teleportation.
Okay.
Solid choice. Absolute solid choice.
Okay. Yeah. Not what I was expecting, but I'll take that.
That'd be my dream.
Yeah, that'd be pretty cool. In fairness, if you could have any animal as a pet, what would you have?
Oh, I love my dog.
I look. I love dogs too. I know that already that Leah's going to say dog, right?
Oh, what if I said something else?
Yeah, but really, is that dog? Yeah, I mean, okay.
Fine.
Something a bit more imaginative, but
wow, I'm being called out here today. Listen, I'm a boring perfectionist, okay? Let's see. Okay, I would maybe want like a big cuddly like a bear
solid
who
choice.
wouldn't maul me.
Solid choice. Oh yeah, I mean the hypothetical here is that it would be friendly, right? So it wouldn't. You could have anything. It wouldn't try and rip your face off or anything like that. Leah, surprise
like
me.
Like a red panda.
Oh, red panda. Red pandas are cool.
Something like super adorable and like
Yeah.
cuddly.
Yeah.
Sign me up.
Okay. I'd have a tiger, which is weird because I don't like cats. If you could have, I mean, well, it's more like cats don't like me. If you could have a never-ending supply of one thing, what's that question? If you could have a never-ending supply of one thing, what would that thing be?
Energy, because I have a 3-year-old and I'm very tired.
Good. I like that answer. Leah, Olympic coverage?
Yeah. Sports.
Yeah.
All of it, all the time.
Fair enough. All right. Last one then. If you could change careers right now, what would you choose?
I would be a travel blogger.
Nice.
Stunt car driver.
Stunt car driver.
I'm always like super fascinated with people who can drive. I think it's so cool. Like, how? I don't understand it. I think it's wild and amazing, and I'm fascinated by it.
I wasn't expecting that.
It's never too late, Leah.
I'm gonna sign up for driving lessons.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Well, that was illuminating. Thank you, Marina, for playing our getting to know you game.
No, you didn't answer. What career would you choose?
Oh, I'd be a comfy chair tester.
Oh, solid choice.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That's a great choice. Although, how many hours a day would you have to do that?
Oh, all of them.
24.
Yeah.
Full.
Yeah.
Sleep in a chair, eat in a
Thanks for
chair,
it.
bathe in a chair.
Yeah, okay, maybe draw the line at that. But yeah, thank you, Marina, for playing our getting to know you game. I feel like we've gotten to know you a little bit better. So thank you so much.
Awesome.
Okay, so just a little bit of time before we finish up here, and we've talked about a whole load of different things today. A couple of things that sort of jumped out for me when we were talking about right at the start, almost about the range of different behaviors that are maybe associated with some of the disordered eating. So even just kind of things like just looking at nutrition. Looking at what I'm taking on board, and there's so many kind of different ways of doing that. So the MyFitnessPal app, for example, and I know there's kind of other very, very similar things. What's your take on things like that? That just almost facilitate. They almost kind of encourage us into these ways of eating and these relationships with food that are maybe kind of not that great.
Yeah. My recommendation is for you to delete FitnessPal on your phone. Not you, Pete, but like listeners.
I did. Years ago, I did. It was it was unhealthy. It was just, it was unhealthy.
Yeah. Way to go. Way to go. You're halfway there. So for anyone listening, delete any calorie counting diet apps on your phone, on your computer. Don't engage with them, and pick up an intuitive eating book instead.
Talk to me a little bit about that, intuitive eating.
Oh, it's magical. Intuitive eating is magical. It was created by dietitians Evelyn Tribole and Elise Reich, and it is a great guide for anybody who is looking to heal their relationship with food and exercise. They have 10 very easy to follow along steps. They talk about the data behind dieting and how that impacts weight and why to take an anti-diet approach. And they have very actionable steps for people looking to heal their relationship with food and their body. Now, there's a caveat. If you are struggling with an eating disorder, you should not pick up an intuitive eating book because first you need to cultivate a regular and sufficient eating schedule, enough for your hunger signals to come back and actually get in sync with those hunger signals. So when somebody has been restricting food intake, their hunger signals depress and they get lowered, and someone is not super in tune with them. And that leads to these extreme cycles of like under eating, overeating, and people thinking they're eating enough, but actually aren't. So do that first and then pick up an intuitive eating book.
Okay. And just to kind of clarify, just in terms of intuitive eating, like what do we mean by that? Is this kind of like eating when you're hungry, not eating when you're not hungry? Like,
yep, exactly. So it's eating based on physical hunger signals, but also psychological hunger signals or cravings. It is taking a balanced approach to eating where all foods fit in moderation. And it's also about like challenging the sort of diet culture messages that we've been receiving our entire life and looking to food as fuel, but also as a source for joy, pleasure, connection.
Awesome. Cool. Well, what we'll do is we'll probably try and put a link to that book as well in the episode description. So if anybody is interested, they can go and look that up. Leah, what stood out for you from today's discussion? Anything jumped out at you?
Yeah, the thing that I keep thinking about is I work with a lot of collegiate athletes, and there are a lot of structural issues in how can we make sure that our athletes are eating appropriately when all they have available to them is like what's on campus. And the campus dining isn't always open, when they need to be eating. And something that I also see is that like for some of our athletes is that they just generally like aren't eating enough, that they, not from a restrictive perspective, but they don't realize like how much food they actually need to eat to perform well.
Yes.
And how many, like from an intake perspective. And I think sometimes when we talk about these conversations or have these conversations, we focus so much on the restrictive components of food, whereas like you may not even be overtly trying to restrict your food, but you don't understand the actual needs of your body, and you're actually underfueling your body inadvertently.
Guideline is 3 meals and 3 snacks for athletes. The quick and dirty guideline. I apologize if there are any dietitians listening to this. But quick and dirty guideline, 3 meals, 2 to 3 snacks, especially for athletes. And if you don't have access to a dietitian, you can always use the plate method. Most athletes or people who are active need half a plate of starchy carbohydrates, a quarter plate of some type of protein, and then a quarter plate of like fruit, vegetables, and then a dietary fat. And that can get people started. So if you're an athlete and you are eating on campus, make sure you're getting that at least. Because you're right, most athletes might not be trying to restrict, but I do think that a lot of athletes don't realize how much they actually need to be fueling their body. And that is perpetuated in part by the inaccurate calories in, calories out, or like energy in, energy out paradigm. And that does not apply. That's actually such a inaccurate and oversimplified version of what people need to be eating and fueling. So
yeah, I find nutrition generally like it's almost like there's 2 extremes when we talk about diet and nutrition. Like on the one end, it's like calories in, calories out, and like you have to have this many calories and lose this many, or decrease by this many calories if you want to lose 1 pound, whatever, blah blah blah. Very like black and white, straightforward. And then on the other end, it's like it's so overly complicated in terms of like, well, what percentage and what is, like macros and, all of these like really nitpicky, detaily kind of things that like aren't super necessary either. Like, and especially for like high performance athletes, when they're already tracking like 9 million things, like there's a tendency to go overboard with it. And we kind of lose like in the middle, like I think one of the ways in which intuitive eating can be really useful is finding that middle ground of like, you don't have to become overly fixated on like your macronutrients, your micronutrients or whatever, as long as you're making sure that you're like eating the rainbow and eating like enough, so you have energy and all of these things. But like, you don't have to go overboard of like, well, what's your blood type and what is like blah, blah, blah. Like, but I feel like a lot of that middle ground is lost in a lot of these conversations, but that's also like where most athletes and most people fall.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And one thing to think about for a lot of people is that most people's bodies actually have a weight set point, an area where their body likes to be. And weight and shape is so much less controllable than the diet and fitness industry wants us to think. So you could be spending all this time on like macros and blood type and keto, whatever, and maybe not even changing your body that much, or at least not changing it sustainably in the long term. And so like, why do that? Enjoy your life. Eat food, but also like move your body in meaningful ways. Eat when you're hungry. Make sure you get satisfied and connect with people.
I mean, and I think also we kind of forget that form follows function, right? That like your body's going to look like how you train it to look like. And so like when you have athletes who are big power lifters, like they need their body to do certain things. You're going to have like a certain amount of shape based on the things that you're asking your body to do. There are so many different ways that your body can look and be successful and be high performing athletes and be high performing Olympians and elite athletes. There is no one way that you're going to look that like this says this is what an athlete looks like. It's like,
That's right.
no, like the athletes look like all kinds of different things. And a lot of it is based on like, if you're a basketball player, you're probably gonna be tall. Like it has nothing to do with what your intake is, right? It has to do with what you're trying to achieve and what you're asking your body to do and
your genetics. Like it's okay if your genetics look different than other people's genetics.
Yeah, like there's so little that you have control.
Okay, Marina, last word to you. Anything from the discussion that we've had today that stood out? Anything that you would want to tell our listeners? Any kind of take-home messages, if you could sum up?
That's a great question. I think my take-home would be to just let listeners know that you have so much more value to offer this world than what you look like and what you put in your body.
Yeah, and I think we don't hear that message enough, I think. Marina, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. It's been a really wonderful discussion, and I'm so pleased that we were able to make it happen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really appreciative of being able to talk with you guys today.
No problem at all. Oh, before you go, however, did you want to give a quick plug to your consultancy?
Sure.
You don't have to, but you can do.
Sure.
Free marketing. Would you like it?
Yeah.
I guess so. I'm such a poor business person at times because I'm like, no,
Don't talk about me.
Should probably take advantage of that opportunity. So yeah, if you want to learn more, if you have questions that came up during this podcast, like, hey, do I need to change my relationship with food, or is somebody I love being affected by this? You can contact me at marina@bloomspsychologync.com. My practice website is www.bloomspsychologync.com, and fill out a contact form, and I'm happy to talk more about it. I also talk about this stuff a lot on social media. So if you would like a non-diet content creator, you can follow me at Dr. Marina Harris on all platforms. One other thing, can I add one thing really quick?
Yeah, please
do. One service I also offer through my practice is consultation for professionals. So if you're a mental health professional or a sports psychology professional and you have a question about when to make a referral, or you want to talk through a client with me, you can book a consultation meeting with me. So that's something that a lot of professionals like to take advantage of because it's really important to have an expert in your corner.
I'm going to call you.
Please do. Please do. I love doing consultation. I used to work at Duke and UNC in these medical centers where I trained residents, and I was working with psychiatrists and all these medical professionals, and I kind of missed that. So
awesome. And we will make sure that we put links to all of those websites and all of your socials in the episode description. So if anybody is listening and wants to get in touch, they can do that really easily. So yeah, it just leaves me to say thank you so much once again for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was really fun.
This was the 80% Mental Podcast with myself, Dr. Leah Washington, and Dr. Marina Harris. And if you have enjoyed what you've been listening to, don't forget you can subscribe at 80percentmental.com. You can follow us on social media at EPM Podcast on Twitter or at 80percentmental on Instagram. And just to remind you once again, if you have been affected by anything that you've heard in this episode, first of all, there is tremendous strength in seeking help. So if it's on your mind and you're thinking about whether to get help or not, please know that there is just tremendous strength in doing so. And like Marina said, you can also contact her if you are interested in finding out a little bit more. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Leah. You've been here as well.
I have been, and it's been lovely. I love this conversation. It's been great.
And we will see you next time.
Will we?
Well, no, because it's a podcast. So probably not.